Sasha already introduced me. My name is Martin Helmich. Yes, and I'm going to talk to you about deployment architectures with TYPO3 Surf, Git and Jenkins. Yes, I work at Mitfold. I already said that as a software developer, software architect. I don't just do PHP development. Lately I've done a lot of systems development. I do program a lot of Python, even some C programming now and then. Yes, so that's about it. So I'm mainly going to focus on working with TYPO3 Surf, and the first time I heard about TYPO3 Surf was actually quite here. It was roughly a year ago. And I believe it was Christopher who mentioned it in a talk. And when I heard about TYPO3 Surf, I thought, hey, it sounds really great. And roughly at the same time, I was at Mitfold in charge with implementing a continuous integration workflow with Jenkins. And we also thought about automated deployment of software systems. So, of course, the thought came to mind if you couldn't combine Jenkins and Surf to achieve a completely automated deployment toolchain. And, well, yes, the answer is yes, it actually works. It works quite well. And yes, I'd like to talk to you about how this can be achieved. But first of all, a little disclaimer. TYPO3 Surf is relatively new, so there aren't really any best practices on how to achieve things, especially in combination with Jenkins. I didn't find any prior work in this regard. So I present some ideas and approaches that work well for us at Mitfold, but I don't know if it's really best practice. So I'll be looking forward to hearing your opinions on this later on. All right, so basically it's about software deployment, and maybe I'll begin with a short look back into the history of software deployment. When I started with web application development, I deployed my software like this. That was quite some time ago. I didn't develop Flow 3 back then. Flow didn't even exist at the time. And it was, to save myself, this was before I started professional application development. So, but it may look crude, but in some scenarios this actually works. But I think I don't have to go into detail on how to explain why FTP deployment doesn't really work. So when coming to professional or large-scale projects, you usually need to find other ways to deploy your web applications onto your web servers. What we did for quite some time was something like this. It still falls into the category of manual software deployment. I think an approach like this is very common, in which you just use your version control system for deploying software. I've worked with Subversion for quite some time, but basically it just works the same with Git. Yeah, so I believe using the version control system is basically a very good approach, but of course there are also some things that you have to consider when doing it like this. For example, these git fetch, git reset, git submodule steps, to have to do it manually, it's quite tedious work and it's very error prone. when I first started working with Git, I actually came from Subversion. My favorite was to forget to update the submodules. When working with SVN, you are used to them updating automatically, like SVN externals. And yes, then you can't figure out why it actually doesn't work. And then you think, oh, we tested it and all the unit tests went through and we've tested it in our QA system 1,000 times and it still doesn't work and I don't know why and oh yes, submodules, crap. And the probability of making errors when doing such a manual deployment, of course, even increases when you don't deploy your software to just one target node, but when you have a larger scale application where you have maybe 2, 4, 10, or in extreme edge cases, even more servers. So what I did then was switching to automated deployments. We used Apache Ant for a time. It's a tool actually originating from the world of Java development. There's also a PHP implementation. It's called Thing, I believe, but I haven't really worked with it. Yes, when working with Ant, you have these XML configuration files. As we all know, Java developers love XML. They do everything in XML. And yes, this is how an Ant deployment could look like. It does have to be run on the server side, of course, to do the git fetch. You could also do it the other way around. But yeah, this does work actually, but here we also have yes, we have several pitfalls. First of all, we need to have Java installed on the web server for Ant to work, and every time I go to one of our system administrators and ask them, hey, can we install a Java virtual machine on any of our servers, they practically skin me. So this doesn't work really well either. Yes, and this is where deployment tools like TYPO3 Surf come into play. Before I start on TYPO3 Surf, I'd like to ask you, which one of you has already worked with TYPO3 Surf? All right, that's, I believe that that were actually more than I expected, but I think most people didn't raise their hand just now. At least more than who did raise their hands. So, before starting about, talking about how to integrate it with Jenkins, I'll spend a few minutes to explain how TYPO3 Surf actually works. So, when working with Surf, we have a server-side directory structure that might look roughly like this. And as you will see, TYPO3 Surf does not naively create a Git repository and just always pulls, but TYPO3 Surf manages multiple releases at the same time. So, of course, there's also a Git clone, we can see it here. But when starting a new deployment, TYPO3 Surf basically pulls the new changes from Git and creates a new release directory from this. And this is the directory that that you see right there. The timestamp is coded in it. And in order not to have to keep these timestamp coded release names in mind, there's a symlink called current, and it's always pointing to the currently active release. So if we imagine that this is a web server, we can just point our document root to this current symlink, and we can ensure that our server always delivers the current version of our application. So then when we start a new deployment, Surf will do this. The old release that was previously active, it stays there. You can configure it how many old releases Surf shall keep. And Surf basically just switches the current symlink onto your new release. It keeps the old release and keeps a previous symlink on the old release, so you can still access it. And of course, the advantage of this approach is that while creating the new release, TYPO3 Surf does not touch the currently active release. So it's a deployment that is running does not affect the availability of your web application. And yes, when you switch the symlink to a new target, that's, well, it's not atomic in a strict sense, but it is virtually atomic. So there are perhaps a few milliseconds in which, when a user hits your web server and the symlink has been deleted and the new one has not yet been created, but I think that's a rather theoretical case. Yes, I already said that with the document root. And of course you still have the old release available, so if something goes wrong, if there's a bug you haven't seen, which doesn't happen, of course, because you thoroughly test, so there aren't any bugs. But if you should have overlooked something, it's no problem, you can just switch the current symlink back onto the previous release. Installing Surf is actually quite easy. It's a TYPO3 flow package. This means that every TYPO3 Surf installation, yes, it's based on the TYPO3 flow stack. Although there's no web GUI for administrating for using Surf. It's all command line, which is good because then we can call it automatically. So you can just clone it from Git. I've always been more comfortable with that. I haven't really had much time to look into Composer, but you can also install it using Composer and add it as a dependency. I think in most cases you would just want the current master branch of Surf. There's not any stable release yet.
So, maybe I can say some words
All right. But in my experience, the version that you can pull from the master branch is relatively stable, so we haven't had any problems with it. So usually it's quite fine. So a quick look at how TYPO3 Surf actually works. This is the Surf default workflow, but it's important to note that that this workflow isn't hard-coded. You can modify it as you like, you can create even entirely new workflows, but I believe this default workflow is quite, it fits well for 99% of all scenarios. So far, I haven't found the necessity to add any new stages or to reorder them. It works quite well, actually. So, and here's how it works. TYPO3 Surf usually starts with initializing your deployment. This stage is only run once, when you start the deployment for the first time. And during the initialize stage, yes, it creates the directory structure that I showed here. It creates a Git clone. When you are using Composer, you can do a Composer install. You can also do that in the update stage. at your discretion, really. Yes, in the update stage, you can Surf pulls new commits into your Git repository, provided you did not just clone it back then in the initialize stage. You can do a composer update, and yes, it's actually you can configure it in your deployment what Surf is actually supposed to do in these stages. I believe in the default implementation, some stages are entirely empty by default, and you have to assign tasks to these stages manually. Well, the migrate stage should be relatively clear, I believe. When you deploy a TYPO3 flow application, you usually do a Doctrine migrate in the stage. When deploying any other application, like for example a TYPO3 CMS page, that's also possible. You could, for example, use the migrate stage to perform the database comparison step. There's a TYPO3 extension that allows to perform the steps that you usually have to do in the installation with it in the TYPO3 backend by using command line switches. There aren't any Surf tasks yet to do this, so you'll have to write them yourself. Actually, I did write some tasks on that uses the core API extension. When I find the time, I'll publish it on GitHub sometime, or we merge it into the official Surf repository or whatever. The finalize stage is usually just for cleanup before switching the release. In the finalize stage, you could, for example, I don't know, compile STSS files, minify JavaScript, anything like that. Yes, then in the test stage, you can test your new release. You could, for example, rerun all your unit tests. Won't be necessary in our case because we have Jenkins to do that. But you could, for example, also use the test stage to perform a rudimentary smoke test. There are also already tasks for that. And that works as follows. I'll just switch back to the directory structure. While performing a deployment, Surf also creates a next link that points to the release that is currently being deployed. And if you're already through the finalized stage of your deployment, the release that the next symlink is pointing to should actually already be runnable. So what you can do is that you create a new virtual host on your server, point it to the next directory, and you can access the next release of your software using the web interface, and yes, you can test it before switching it to before switching the current symlink. I believe the default implementation just does HTTP requests, but I don't know, it might also be possible to run a full-blown UI test suite like Selenium or Behat. I heard about Behat the first time this weekend. It sounds really great. I'll definitely need to have a look at it. But yes, you can do that in the test stage. Alright, the switch stage I think should be clear. You just switch the symlink to the current release, and yes, you can customize it if you like, but that shouldn't be necessary. Yes, and the cleanup stage is for cleanup tasks, obviously. So you could remove any temporary files that were created during, I don't know, SCSS compilation. You could clear your caches. When working with a TYPO3 flow application, you just do a cache flush, or even better, a cache warm-up. When working with TYPO3 CMS sites, you can also use the core API extension. There's also a task for clearing the cache. So it's getting warm up here. So, yes, this is how Surf works. And now we can have a look at how you can use Jenkins to optimize this process even further. And, well, of course, the thought that comes to mind first is that you try to fully automate your deployment. Yes, this is a possible workflow how it could be done. In this approach, you work with a Git repository. Currently, when working with Surf, you should always use a Git repository, because Surf always pulls your changes using Git. Although it's actually not that big a deal. You could write a task to fetch it from a SVN repository. You could use rsync to publish it on the server without any versioning system at all. There's actually no real limitation to that. We do it like this. We have a Git repository, and when a new commit is pushed into this repository, Jenkins is notified about this change. You can do this using a post receive hook. It's usually the best way. You can also have Jenkins poll your Git repository, but then you always have a short latency between these poll intervals. So using hooks is usually the best way. Yes, then you will usually have Jenkins trigger a main build of your project, and yes, what you do in this build is mainly up to you. Common tasks would maybe include running unit tests to ensure that everything works. You could also, for example, update your submodule pointers if that's necessary. Depends on your repository structure. You can packetize it. You can compile SCSS files and push them into Git if that fits with your workflow, and so on. Yesterday, Thomas had showed also a Jenkins workflow, and I saw that he had many more jobs that were cascading in his Jenkins architecture. I didn't want to overcomplicate this slide, so of course what I have grouped in one main build here, you can of course split up into several builds. You can have a build that just runs your tests. You can have another build for updating your submodules, and you can even run them all in parallel if you like to speed things up. So this is highly customizable on how you want to do it. In this case, the main build, when it's finished successfully, triggers two other builds. One build, yes, for lack of a better word, I've called it auxiliary build. We use a build like this to perform tasks that don't affect the stability of the software in any way. Yes, you can. We use this task to generate the API documentation and to get some certain code metrics. The reason why you put stuff like this into an extra build is because these can take up quite some time. We use PHP-MD to measure some code metrics, and I don't know, if it runs over our entire code base, it takes 2 hours. And of course, when you push a change to Git, you don't want to wait 2 hours for PHPMD to compute the cyclomatic complexity of every damn method just before the deployment starts. So this is why you should run it asynchronously. Yes, and then there's the deployment build, and yes, then you can have the deployment build called TYPO3 Surf. I already said TYPO3 Surf is just a command line application, so the easiest way to do this would just implement a small bash script in Jenkins. I think there's already, no, I know there's already a build step just for running bash script in Jenkins. There's also a Jenkins plugin specifically for running Surf. I wrote it myself, but it's not very thoroughly tested. So I'll give you the link on GitHub to the location at the end. If you'd like to test it, please do test it. Yes, now I've lost track. All right. So, are you just stretching, or is it a question? Go ahead.
We have the problem that the installer scripts most times need super user rights for setting file permissions. And we basically, for every project we are deploying with Surf, add a pseudo script so Jenkins can set these file permissions. How's your Jenkins plugin tackling that issue?
We do it I'll repeat the question first because I don't know if everyone got it. So the question was that you'll need super user permissions to set the file permissions when you've started the deployment. We do it like this. We connect as the user that the software is actually to be executed as, and then usually the file permissions are already fitting. So we don't need to execute the set file permissions step.
I will remove the base interface because it's just really bad idea.
You can also do, yes, use just like you said, a sudo script, or you can have Surf connect as a root. I didn't say that. Please forget it.
Just don't tell your IT.
Oh, they'll do more than skim me. Alright. So, let's focus on some other ideas on how to optimize your Surf deployment with Jenkins. I already said that the deployment build and our auxiliary build can run asynchronously and in parallel, and the idea comes to mind that when you're deploying to multiple nodes, that you might also want to try to parallelize that. I'm not really so sure about this, if it's a good idea. So if there's any feedback on this later on, I'd be happy to hear it. The idea is the following. TYPO3 Surf usually just works completely sequentially. So when we're deploying to 4 nodes, it iterates over each stage, and for each stage it iterates over each node and performs the deployment step. And of course the necessity to even think about parallelizing it depends on how long your deployments take. Usually if you just do git pull, it runs rather fast, so if it makes a difference if your deployment runs 1 minute or 2 or 4, you can think about parallelizing it. But for example, if you're working with Composer and your dependencies change frequently and you have to download new dependencies on every deployment, this might be worth thinking about. So if we parallelize this, of course we can save a lot of time. But of course nothing is for free. So yes, there's obviously a catch in it. But before we come to that, let's first have a look at how you could do it. My approach would be, in Jenkins there's a feature, it's called multi-configuration build. So you can basically run the same build over and over again in parallel, and just differing in values of configuration variables that you can specify. And what you could do is that you simply start a multi-configuration build with each, do you see the point, the laser point up there? That you configure your configuration matrix to start a separate build for each node that you want to deploy to. This will basically result in, as you can see here, it will result in one master build and one separate build for each node that Jenkins will then execute in parallel. You can also cluster Jenkins. This means that you can add further build processors that reside on remote machines if the need really arises. But yeah, when using reasonable hardware, you can do 12 deployment builds in parallel. Why not? It's just network I/O eventually. So usually you don't need more build nodes. This is how a deployment configuration could look like. I just showed you these configuration matrix, and Jenkins does it this way. Here you also see the Surf deployment step for Jenkins. And Jenkins uses environment variables to communicate these variables to your build. This may be crude at a first glance, but it works for nearly everything you want to do. So we can query these environment variables in our Surf deployment and then simply just deploy to the one node that is specified in the Jenkins build. And to have it compatible to when you call the deployment just manually, you might implement a fallback that it deploys on all nodes sequentially. Yes, I've already also highlighted it. Alright, so I said that there's a downside, and of course there is. One, for example, is this scenario when the deployment filled just for one specific node. When there's an error, I don't know what could happen. A loss could happen. So let's just imagine that you deploy to 4 nodes, and for some whatever reason you can't deploy to node 2. So now the problem is that when all these builds run in parallel and independent of each other, then the deployments on nodes 1, 3 and 4 won't know that the deployment to node 2 failed. So what TYPO3 Surf usually does when there's an error, it rolls back all stages that it's already run through. And of course, this doesn't happen when doing this in parallel. So yes, the Jenkins build fails, there's a red light going on, and on the node where the deployment failed, you actually have the rollback, but not on the other nodes. So you'll have to find a way around that. One possible way to do so is to split the deployment stages into 2 actual deployments. One that does only the initialize, update and finalize stages, and then another deployment that does only the switch and cleanup stage. There's also the Jenkins plugin that would allow you to trigger another build when the deployment build fails. Then you could do the rollback on the remaining nodes. Yeah. Again, I'm not so sure if this would really work. I haven't tested it myself because at Midval we usually don't have the need for massively parallel deployments. So I'll just leave that open for discussion afterwards. Another way how you can optimize your TYPO3 Surf deployments is to use Jenkins to simply get a very good feedback on on the results of your deployment. When you do continuous integration, you'll probably know this. Of course, you sorry. Of course, there's the red light that goes on in Jenkins. Jenkins sends emails when a build fails, but I have to admit I've come to ignore the emails from Jenkins because there are just so many. But fortunately, Jenkins offers many possibilities to get very extreme feedback on your build success or your build failures. And I believe the classical example, I think one of the Jenkins developers implemented it live at some conference, is the example with the glowing bear lamps. The link is down there. There it is described in detail how these glowing bears work. I think he used power switches with TCP/IP port that you can access using the network. This is a gimmick, of course. You don't really need it, but it's better than emails that end up in your spam mailbox. Of course, if you don't have any glowing bears, I've heard they're hard to come by. You can also use one of the Jenkins monitoring plugins. Just throw this view on a monitor in your office, and then you have also a very direct feedback if something goes wrong. These feedbacks also display which user caused the failing build. So you also know which one of your developers to punch if something goes wrong. All right. As a last note, I'd like to show you this. This is practically everything I've just told you about how we use it at Midwald. It's basically what I just told you. In addition, we have a Garrett code review system before our Git repository, just to ensure that that every change is peer reviewed before being merged into the repository. You probably know Garrett from review typo3.org. It's the exact same software. Yes, there's also a subversion repository. It's there for historical reasons. Please ignore it. As you can see, in our architecture there are 2 Jenkins servers. There are also 2 Git servers, but this has network architectural reasons. So the Git servers basically synchronize themselves, and both Jenkins servers practically do the same. So they just deploy different Git branches. All right. So in conclusion, we can say that yes, of course, TYPO3 Surf is optimized for deploying TYPO3 Flow applications or TYPO3 Neos application, which is a TYPO3 Flow application. But I've made the experience that you can use TYPO3 Surf to deploy virtually anything. I've just lost a few words about TYPO3 CMS. I've also managed to deploy a WordPress blog with it. Of course, then you also have to worry about what to do with database migrations and so on. I don't really know how this behaves in WordPress. And I'm no WordPress expert, but the need hasn't arisen yet to worry about it. And yes, basically at the moment you can deploy anything that you can put into a Git repository. We have a lot of custom applications that don't use any of the major frameworks, and we can deploy them with Surf also. All right. To wrap it up, this is a list of useful Jenkins plugins that you might use. Of course, there's the Git plugin. You'll need it to have Jenkins listen at your Git repository for new changes. When using Garrett, there's also a Garrett trigger that you can use. to have Jenkins build your changes from your review system before they are merged. You'll need the build result trigger when you try to implement the parallel surf builds I just told you about. And yes, if you like risk, you can also try out the TYPO3 Surf builder. All right. So, do you have any questions? Yes?
You said on your two parts of the Git Jenkins parts, you have just different branches. So you need to put something to the live server, you have something like a live branch, and otherwise you work on your master branch.
Yes, so the question was how, I'll go back to this slide. The question was how we work with the Git branches on our different deployment targets. So, yes, basically we have a production branch which is very strictly protected by Gerrit. And then there's a master branch which we use TYPO3 Surf to deploy it to our QA and into our integration environment. Does this answer the? All right.
Just a remark. If someone wants to know how to deal with branches in Git, there's a very, very good approach and a blog article called "The Successful Story in Branching and Releasing." I can share the link later. Which tells you how to deal with release branches and feature branches, and it's a really good approach.
Oh, all right. So this was, just to repeat it, this was just a remark on how to work with Git branches. There's a blog article on using Git with release branches. I don't know, if you send me the link, I can put it into the presentation before uploading it to SlideShare. Then you can all have it. I believe there was a question.
Just one question. What happens, or how do you deal with migrating, back migrating, or rollbacking on the database side? If you're removing a column, for example, what happens within these columns if you roll back again? So is there any help from Surf or from migration use to hold the data, or back up the data and restore it, or put it back into the database again?
So the question was how to handle Doctrine, rollbacks of Doctrine migrations. Theoretically, every type, that's the best way to begin an answer, isn't it? In theory, every TYPO3 Surf task is rolled back when an error occurs. In the rollback method of the TYPO3 Doctrine migrate task, I looked into the code, there's a comment, please implement me, or something like that. So actually at the moment, you don't have an automatic rollback for Doctrine migrations. For us this isn't a big problem because we don't use Doctrine, but yes, we use databases, but we use a different migration software for that. Exactly.
Anyway, still, because I have the same question. When you play a new version, but it's still not connected to the current, the database is already migrated with whatever solution. So the old code base shall not work with this database structure. Do you block for this moment aside or something, or you just hope that nothing happens?
Yes, the question was about the short time period of inconsistency between the Doctrine migration, which comes first, and the actual switch to the release. Yes, I haven't really thought about it. As I just mentioned, we don't use Doctrine for migrations, so for me the need hasn't arisen yet, but I believe Christopher's already.
Something about that, and also about the question of
Yeah, so there's some approach where you make your migrations backwards compatible. For example, don't remove a column, and if you rename something, don't remove and add, but only add, and in the next release it will remove, so it should always be safe. Of course, it could be hard to tell that to every developer and to make sure that every migration follows this, but this in theory should work. And so the new database version should be compatible with the old application state. Yeah, so with continuous delivery you can then schedule the next migration to remove the old column. And I think most big projects use something like that to have always compatible database schemas.
Do you have any best practices handling race conditions during the deployment? So like Martin said, do you have any practices?
Race conditions during deployment? Not really. So.
Just switch off your live site for just a couple of seconds.
Yeah, I mean, it would be easy to introduce some task that would, for example, put your application into a locked state before migration, and after switch, release that locked state. So, but then you really have a short outage. So, in the beginnings, we implemented Surf to really have a deployment without delay, because it was for a web service backend that shouldn't have any downtime ever, ideally. Yeah.
I think it highly depends on what you have in your database, because if you only have sessions, for example, you might think of putting them to another cache backend, and so you could switch databases. If you have your domain data, it's an external system. So you don't need to have that, so you just can switch databases. You have two databases migrate to 150% deployment, for example, so it depends on which data you are going to migrate. And I think there's no general rule for that, you have to adapt to your project. And I think most projects will find a way to deploy your database.
Yeah. So I don't know if we have the time. Only some words about the question with the release and when it's stable. So yeah, we talked about with some guys what's missing. So we have some plans. Of course, there's always limited time. So I think we will go into some kind of crowdfunding to say, okay, these are the last steps to make Surf stable. Have a website, some more documentation, collect recipes from various people that already have some experience and have a cookbook online about deployments, and also we have some features on the list for better option handling with this environment variables, which many people do, or options of command line, which I think the AOE approach uses, and also having a better rollback support, doing manual rollbacks, also these database rollbacks. This is why there's a to-do. We had the idea, and also the migrate command outputs a list of versions already. So we have to store these migrated versions and then do a rollback on these, the down migration. So this is all planned, and yeah. So we are looking for sponsors, and maybe if someone feels like it would be cool to sponsor that. So there's nothing official yet, any information, but that is the plan. So I think in the next month there will be the first stable release if we succeed with that. Yeah.
Right. So, yes, one question.
How this Surf is working with resources, or not resources, but things like this key, which is used for others. This is written data directory persistent. How does
Yes, let me get back to the slide where I showed the directory structure. Yes, you see the shared directory, and in there you can put all resources that should be shared between all releases. And in your release, you can then put a symlink into your shared directory, and the data inside this directory stays persistent on all releases. All right.
knows that every directory which is there shall not be actually created by the
No, the shared directory is not touched by Surf. So if you just have a symlink in your release pointing to that directory, it will always work. Right, I'm afraid I've already overextended my time slot. So if you have any further questions, I will be around all day. So if there's anything, just ask me. I believe now is lunch break. So thank you for listening and enjoy.